Hello and welcome to this week's reflections on the Revelation to John. Last week we concluded chapter 20, so we're getting very close. There's 22 chapters in the book of Revelation, and we finished talking about this idea of the lake of fire, and the beasts were cast into the lake of fire. The dragon or Satan was cast into the lake of fire. Death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire, and this all characterizes that the lake of fire isn't some place for eternal torment so much as it is just a place of complete obliteration, destruction, non-existence, however you want to frame that. So death and Hades are not tortured or punished. They're not humans, that they simply cease to exist. So the message is a vivid scene. It's a simple one. There will be no more death. Chapter 21, verse 4, we're going to get to in just a little bit. And Paul said, death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? According to 1 Corinthians 15, 54, and 55. So this clears the way for the triumphant visions of chapter 21 and 22. So if you want, pause this video here. If you haven't already, you may want to read or listen to someone else read both chapters 21 and 22, or you may take them separately together, however you best think things through. And please also, while you're pausing, take a moment, if you haven't already, below this YouTube video and click on the subscribe button. And if you have found these videos helpful, maybe give us a thumbs up. And that supposedly triggers a way in which we reach more people. I don't understand it all. I don't need to, but if you have a mind to do that, please do so. So I'll assume that you have looked over chapters 21 and 22 already, and 21, especially verses 1 through 8, seem to be, to me at least, the part of the book of Revelation that everybody wants to read. So let's take a look at what John saw, and also we're going to talk a little bit about what John did not see in this vision. Starting with verses 1 and 2, John's vision is of a new heaven, or the Greek word could also mean sky, and a new earth, reminding him that the first heaven or sky and the first earth has passed away. John has seen the first heaven and the first earth pass away just 5 verses earlier in chapter 20, verse 11. So as we've already talked about, heaven and sky are the same word in Greek. The New International Version, I tend to use the Revised Standard Version or the New Revised Standard Version because those are more closely associated with the Greek or the Hebrew in the Old Testament case. Other translations come from various translations, so they're not always as accurate to the original language as the Revised Standard Version or the New Revised Standard Version. But a problem in the New International Version, if you're using that, is that it does use the appropriate word as sky in chapter 20, verse 11, but here they've obscured that similarity in the two passages because here they use heaven, not sky. So there's a little bit of inconsistency there as far as I'm concerned. But John's point is really that the earth and sky have disappeared, according to chapter 20, verse 11. And now they're all replaced. They're both replaced with a new human world and sky, or you might say universe, perhaps. But something is different, however. There's no longer any sea, according to verse 1. Now, nothing was said in the preceding section about the sea disappearing with the sky and the earth. The sea remained, and with death and Hades being tossed into the lake of fire, The sea did not. He didn't specifically say, oh yeah, the sea was thrown in there too. The sea remained, and death and Hades gave up their dead, according to chapter 20, verse 13. And as soon as the dead were judged, death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. But what about the sea? He didn't specify anything about that. It would be incongruous to have the sea thrown into a lake of fire. So John contents himself simply with the observation that there's no longer any sea. The sea, like Hades, was to him a realm of death. Millions of the dead were buried in the sea, just as millions of the dead are buried in the earth or the world. John was told of a beast coming out of the abyss or a bottomless pit back in chapter 11, verse 7, although what he himself later saw was the beast coming out of the sea, according to chapter 13, verse 1. So there are some phrases that seem interchangeable in John's description of the vision. From John's perspective, the sea, maybe the abyss, and the Hades, maybe they're just all synonymous to him. When he sees the vision, he sees the same thing. They're all amounting to much the same thing as far as he's concerned. So what is more natural for a man, John in this case, who has been exiled or imprisoned on a lonely island to view the waters separating him from his companions on the mainland as waters of death? There wasn't a way for him to escape his exile, so his perception was there's no longer any sea, and that simply is his way of saying that in this new creation, there's no more death, there's no more separation. It implies that the sea, which separated John from his companions, the 7 congregations he's writing to specifically, will no longer do so. Or maybe even the entire faithful of God, as he would describe it. In other words, it's another way of saying all of God's people will be together in this new world order that God creates. It is possible, by ignoring the chapter divisions and the verse divisions, which again were not in the original letter as John wrote it. It were inserted for purposes of Bible study and easy reading, I guess. So it's possible to draw chapter 21, verse 1 into the preceding chapter, verse 20, as kind of a concluding element in this 4-part structure for prose, if you will. So it would be like a reversal that we've talked about, or I've talked about before in some of Paul's letters as I've done Bible studies. So the reversal would be A, the sea gave up the dead that was in it. B, death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. Then reverse that. B, death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. A, there was no longer any sea. So for John, it's quite simple. For us, we try to make it complicated. So God's new creation then consists of a new sky and a new earth without the sea. And what the sea represents to John, in other words, death and separation. Above all, it consists of the holy city, a new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, which makes it more about heaven than just sky, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband, verse 2. John has no interest in the new sky and the new earth for their own sake. For him, they set the stage for the new center of his attention, the new Jerusalem, or the new holy city. The new Jerusalem is prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband, according to verse 2. This city is also personified as a woman, a pure and holy bride, to be specific. The bride was mentioned in passing once before, chapter 19, verses 7 and 8, when she represented the saints, or the people of God, the redeemed, the virgins who followed the Lamb wherever he went, according to chapter 14, verses 4 and 5. They now have ruled with Christ on earth for 1,000 years, according to chapter 20, verses 4 through 6. And the holy city, the New Jerusalem, is not so much a place as it is the people, specifically the people living in the presence of their God. Looking more specifically, verses 3 to 8, is if there is one speech that captures in a nutshell the meaning of the entire book of Revelation, I think this would be it. John hears a loud voice from the throne announcing, in the third person here, the significance of what John has just seen, verses 3 and 4. It says, then he who was seated on the throne continues speaking in the first person, verses 5 through 8. So the message is one, despite the changing voices, first person and third person. The voice of the throne begins by calling John's attention to the vision he has just seen in the third person. See, the home of God is among mortals, that is, with humankind. This means that he will dwell with them, they will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. The message is intended for John and the 7 congregations in their day and equally for us today. It's future-oriented language in that the language of God's ancient covenant, which we could also describe as an agreement, a contract, a promise, whatever works best for your thought processes. And the original covenant was with the Jewish people. God told Moses to tell Israel, I will place my dwelling in your midst, and I shall not abhor you. I will be your God, and you will be my people. You can see that in Leviticus 26, 11, and 12. So this changes in the New Testament, where Paul reminds a Gentile congregation at the city of Corinth, we are the temple of the living God. As God said, I will live in them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. See Corinthians 6, verse 16. Similarly, in Revelation, the ancient covenant promises are for his peoples, plural, not simply the people of Israel. That would be a singular, the people. John has not forgotten that Jerusalem is a Jewish city, although John sees it here as representing all the cities and all the people of the world. Yet John is not to be considered a universalist. John's point is not to say that all humans will be saved no matter what, for he's already seen the inhabitants of the earth thrown into the lake of fire. The bride, or New Jerusalem, is simply John's metaphor for those who are redeemed. They are the new humanity. The destiny of others is the second death mentioned in chapter 20, verse 14. Although for this group there is no more death, according to verse 4. So the voice from the throne echoes the imagery of Isaiah chapter 25, verses 6 through 8, which happens to be a favorite of mine, I'll just throw in there. And that reads, on this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wines strained clear. You get now why it's one of my favorite passages? It continues, and he will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the covering that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. Then the Lord God will wipe away the tears from all faces, and the disgrace of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. So the transition from the old order of things have passed away in verse 4 to I am making everything new verse 5, corresponds to a change in speaker from the third person to the first person. Instead of a loud voice from the throne, verses 3 and 4, we now hear from the one who is seated on the throne, verses 5 through 8. This is one of only two places in the entire book where God speaks personally and directly. The other place was chapter 1, verse 8, where it said, I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. Here too, God identifies himself as, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, according to verse 6. And here too, gives the impression of speaking to John in his own time and his immediate situation on the island of Patmos. The good news at the heart of the book of Revelation is this announcement: I am making all things new. This is not something God does only at the end of time. Rather, it is ongoing, already in the present, in this ongoing, continuous fashion, and that it continues to happen over and over again. God is making all things new, repeatedly. This is for the 7 congregations to which John wrote, and it's also good news for us in our troubled world today. It is a trustworthy and true pronouncement, so crucial to the message of the entire book that John is immediately commanded to write this down, according to verse 5. A similar conviction lies at the root of Paul's bold affirmation that, so if anyone is in Christ, there's a new creation. Everything old has passed away. Look, new things have come into being. And you can see that in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17. Whether John was familiar with Paul or whether both were simply using an expression already common among early Christians, it was not a huge step to conclude that a God who remakes individuals is at work remaking the world as well. In the mind of God, if not yet in human experience, it is already done. The voice continues to speak to John and his readers in their current time. The divine self-identification, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, combined with a promise, or promises, if you will, recalls several of Jesus' sayings in the gospel according to John. Some examples: John 6, verse 35, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. John 8, verse 12, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And John chapter 11, verses 25 and 26, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. And then Jesus asked the audience he's speaking to, do you believe this? Here, the speaker from the throne certainly seems to be God rather than Jesus. Although at this point, we could say the two become virtually interchangeable. And you can see that later in chapter 22, verse 13, where Jesus identifies himself as the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. So two promises are attached to the self-identification. First, to the thirsty I will give to drink without cost from the spring of the water of life, verse 6, and you compare that to those various verses in John's Gospel. And the second, those who conquer will inherit all these things, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. Verse 7, you can compare that to the repeated promises to the 7 messages of the 7 churches of Revelation chapters 2 and 3 to those who overcome. These promises should be read as invitations to all who hear John's long letter here read in the congregations of Asia, the 7 churches. But again, this letter would have been spread wide and far, so probably more than just 7 congregations heard this letter being read. And John assumes in that, as we should and Paul does, that there will be some, shall we call them outsiders perhaps, or maybe even inquirers. A term that was used decades ago was seekers. And these folks are assumed to be sitting in these worship assemblies. You can see that in Paul's writing to the 1 Corinthians, chapter 14, verses 23 to 25. They also are attending because they've heard these things from their Christian friends, and they're attending because they are the thirsty who are urged to drink of the water of life that is the Christian message or the gospel. As for the believers who are among those in the assembly, their responsibility is to hear and to take to heart what has been written. And again, heart is the seat of the will, according to first century thinking, not the emotions like we think of in this 21st century Western civilization. So not only are they to hear the words, they're to take them to heart. And above all, to overcome in the face of ridicule, social pressure, and looming persecution, which for them was quite literal. Last comes a warning to all who reject such invitations, whether they call themselves Christians or not. The grim ending is a list of those whose place will be in the fiery lake of burning sulfur, which is the second death described in verse 8. And also you can compare that to chapter 20, verses 14 to 15. Most of the categories of the people who are described, I think, would come as no surprise to any readers or listeners. The vile, murderers, sexually immoral, those who practice magical arts, idolaters, those categories stand outside and are hostile to the Christian communities, at least at that time, to which John is writing. Some may be a little bit more surprising, the reference at the beginning to the list of the cowardly and the faithless. And this recalls Jesus' rebuke to the disciples, where he asks them, "Why are you so afraid?" which literally could have been translated as, "Why are you such cowards?" Have you still no faith? Another question. Mark chapter 4, verse 40, also compared to Matthew chapter 8, verse 26. So such terms seem to refer to those outside of the Christian movement. Also, some of those who are within the 7 congregations who are cowards, who may be unwilling to stand firm in the face of troubles, persecutions, testings, however you want to describe it. And they may not be so much unbelievers as unfaithful Christians, or at least calling themselves Christians. Compare that to Revelation chapter 20, verse 10, where it says, "Be faithful even to the point of death," or chapter 17, verse 14, in which Jesus describes his called, chosen, and faithful followers. Similarly, at the end of the list, there is an emphasis on all liars, recalling Gentile Christians who claim to be Jews, though they are not, but are liars, chapter 3, verse 9, also compared to chapter 2, verse 9, and those who claim to be apostles, but are not, and are similarly found to be false or liars. You can see that in chapter 2, verse 2, chapter 14, verse 5, chapter 22, verse 15, which is still coming up. And if the purpose of these lies was to avoid persecution, then they are also cowardly. So the liars may be the same as the cowardly mentioned earlier, but never is it assumed anywhere in the book of Revelation that all those in Christian congregations are necessarily the overcomers. There may be separate categories of quote-unquote Christians in these congregations. Some inside as well as outside the congregation are destined for this second death, or the fire or sulfur, whatever you want to describe it, this lake. So this sobering conclusion to God's voice from the throne leaves it to us as individuals to decide, where do we wish to stand at the last judgment? Do we want to be the faithful or the unfaithful? Or do we want to fall into one of those categories that we just mentioned? I'll try to squeeze in a little bit more. There's really starting a new section here, although we're just at verse 9 of chapter 21. This section, chapter 21, verse 9 through chapter 22, verse 15, can be taken as a unit. It's odd again, but remember the chapters and verses were added later. John's just writing a letter. You may want to read that section over. Chapter 21, verse 9 through chapter 22, verse 15. And this is a vision of the city from chapter 21, verse 9 through 21. The angel promises to show John the bride, the wife of the Lamb, in verse 9, yet what appears is a city, not a woman. So that changed over as of verse 10. From this point on, the bridal imagery is dropped and it will surface again in chapter 22, verse 17. But the image of the city as a woman is not carried through consistently. The angel shows John the holy city in verses 9 through 14, and then he measures it, length, width, and height, and so on, in verses 15 through 21. It also mentions the mountain, great and high, in verse 10, to which John is taken in the spirit, that is, in his vision, and that's more to be a vantage point to look down on the city rather than literally standing on the top of the mountain. It's his placement to be able to see the city in its entirety. So it is representing Mount Zion itself, according to chapter 14, verse 1, on which the city stands, or rather the city landed in its descent from the sky. The impression of this enormous height in reference to the mountain great and high is confirmed shortly when John sees this great high wall surrounding the city, according to verse 12. In contrast to Babylon, situated in a desert, according to chapter 17, verse 3, and in contrast even to the beloved city standing on the breadth of the earth at the beginning of the millennium, or the end of the millennium, in chapter 20, verse 9. So this city now is three-dimensional, with length, width, and height, all being equal. So the traditional city laid out like a square normally becomes, in John's vision, this giant cube. And I can't help it. I'm going to make a confession here, and I have to include it just because it's me. I couldn't help but think in a vision of Star Trek, The Next Generation, where they face this cube that's flying through space that is a spaceship for the Borg. If you're not a Star Trek fan, just ignore what I just said. But that's what I'm thinking of as John describes this cube instead of a square. And the city is described as 12,000 stadia in length, and as wide and high as it is long. Translated into modern measurements, this could mean almost 1,400 miles long, wide, and high. So imagine a city that stretches approximately from Key West, Florida, up to Toledo, Ohio. And it's just as wide and as tall as it is long. John is looking at a city far beyond comprehension. I can't comprehend that. It's even beyond his power to describe it. So the best interpretation may again be not to see literal measurements here of the city, but rather to see a city beyond our limited imagination. And I'm going to stop there because I'm at the 30-minute mark. I know it's not a great stopping point, but just kind of envision that city and then let it go because we really can't understand something that enormous. And that's the point. It's that enormous. Pick up here next time. If you happen to be in the Sun City Center area, please join us in person, 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings for worship. If you can't be here in person, you can join us online in our live stream, or later you can watch it on this same YouTube channel as a recording. I hope you're having a great week. Take care, and God bless.